For 33 years, Richard Baker carried a truth that poisoned every relationship he ever had. His father was a coward who chose medals over diapers and never looked back. The whole town knew the story. Sergeant Michael Baker shipped out to the Gulf War and simply never came home, leaving his infant son with nothing but questions and a mother's bitter whispers. They were all wrong. When Richard's K-9 partner refused to leave a forgotten shed on a frozen November morning, standing guard over a rusted military footlocker with the same intensity he'd shown detecting roadside bombs in Kandahar, they didn't just find old war souvenirs. They found unopened letters written in a desperate father's hand, a Purple Heart still wrapped in plastic, and $8,000 in cash marked for Richard's future. The core question that shattered Richard's world. If Michael Baker abandoned his family to escape responsibility, why did he save every penny and write letters home that were never sent? The narrative introduces Richard Baker, a veteran whose life is now defined by deliberate isolation and the steady companionship of Mailo, his German shepherd, in the forgotten hills of rural Pennsylvania. As they conduct their dawn patrol, a military ritual that keeps the chaos at bay, Mailo's instincts suddenly pull them off their established route and toward the collapsed storage shed at the property's edge, where the atmosphere shifts from controlled routine to urgent discovery. The footlocker is found, buried beneath 3 decades of dust and denial, and the devastating mystery of Sergeant Michael Baker begins to unravel. The shed's interior smelled like decades of neglect, rotted wood, rusted metal, and something else Richard couldn't name. Decay, maybe, the kind that settles into places people forget about. Dust particles swirled in the thin shafts of morning light that cut through gaps in the weathered planks, and Richard had to duck to avoid a ceiling beam sagging under the weight of time and Pennsylvania winters. Mailo hadn't moved. The dog sat rigid beside the footlocker, his dark eyes fixed on Richard with an intensity that made the veteran's chest tighten. In 10 years of working together, through 2 deployments, countless training exercises, and more close calls than Richard cared to count, he'd learned to read every shift in Mailo's posture, every flick of his ears. This wasn't the alert for explosives or contraband. This was something different, something personal. Richard crouched beside the trunk, his knees protesting the movement. The footlocker was standard military issue, olive drab paint flaking away to reveal patches of rust that had eaten through the metal like a disease. It sat at an angle, one corner sunk into the dirt floor where the shed's foundation had given way years ago. Cobwebs stretched from the lid to the wall behind it, thick and gray with accumulated dust. He brushed his hand across the top, clearing away the grime, and his breath caught. Stenciled across the front in faded white letters, barely visible beneath the corrosion. SGTM. Baker. Richard's hand froze mid-motion. The shed seemed to contract around him, the walls pressing closer, the air growing thinner. He knew that name. He'd carried it his entire life, had worn it on his own uniform, had heard it spoken in whispers behind his back in the small-town diners and gas stations where everyone knew everyone's business. Michael Baker, his father, the man who'd shipped out to the Gulf War when Richard was 6 months old, the man who'd never come home, the man his mother refused to talk about except in clipped, bitter sentences that always ended the same way. He chose that war over us. He chose glory over his family. And that's all there is to say about Michael Baker. Richard stood abruptly, his pulse hammering in his ears. Mailo whined softly, a sound the dog almost never made. Richard paced to the door, stared out at the gray November morning, then paced back. The footlocker sat there like an accusation, like a ghost made solid. He hadn't thought about his father in years, had trained himself not to. What was the point? Michael Baker was a coward who'd abandoned his wife and infant son for the romance of combat. And whatever he'd left behind wasn't worth the emotional real estate it would cost to examine. That's what Richard had told himself for 3 decades. That's what had allowed him to function. But here was the man's footlocker, locked and forgotten in a shed Richard had inherited from his maternal grandfather 5 years ago. He'd never explored the property thoroughly, had never had a reason to. The main house was enough. The land was enough. The solitude was everything. Now he wished he'd burned the shed down the first week. Mailo barked once, sharp and insistent. The dog stood, circled the footlocker, then sat again in the same position, his training overriding whatever instinct was telling him to do something else. Richard knew that behavior. Mailo was saying, "This matters. Handle it." Richard knelt again, slower this time. His hands trembled as he traced the stenciled letters with his fingertips. The paint was rough, raised slightly from the metal beneath. Someone had taken care with this, had made sure the name would last, had wanted anyone who found it to know exactly who it belonged to. The lock was a heavy brass padlock, green with verdigris and seized solid. Richard tugged on it experimentally, but it didn't budge. Whatever key had opened it once was long gone, probably lost in the same fog of time that had buried this trunk in the first place. He stood, his legs unsteady, and walked back to his truck. The morning had gone cold, or maybe that was just him. His hands felt numb as he rummaged through the toolbox in the bed, pushing aside wrenches and screwdrivers until his fingers closed around the bolt cutters. The metal was cold enough to burn. Mailo was waiting exactly where Richard had left him when he returned. The dog's tail thumped once against the dirt floor. Encouragement, or maybe solidarity. Richard wasn't sure which. He positioned the bolt cutters around the padlock's shackle, the jaws barely wide enough to fit. His hands were shaking badly now, and he had to stop, take a breath, force his fingers to steady. This was ridiculous. It was just a box. Just some old military gear his father had left behind when he'd decided his family wasn't worth coming home to. But Richard's body knew something his mind was trying to deny. His heart was racing the way it had in Kandahar, the way it had the moment before Mailo alerted on an IED that would have killed 6 soldiers if they'd taken another 3 steps. His instincts were screaming that whatever was inside this trunk would change everything. He squeezed the handles. The bolt cutters bit into the old brass with a resistance that felt almost deliberate, as if the lock itself didn't want to give up its secrets. Richard put his weight into it, his shoulders straining, and something inside the mechanism gave way with a crack that echoed through the small shed like a gunshot. The padlock fell to the dirt floor with a dull thud. Richard stared at it for a long moment, then at the footlocker. The hasp hung loose now, nothing holding the lid closed except gravity and 34 years of accumulated rust. One hand rested on the cold metal. He could feel his pulse in his fingertips. Mailo pressed his shoulder against Richard's leg, warm and solid and real. Richard lifted the lid. The hinges screamed in protest, metal grinding against metal. And then the trunk was open and the morning light was spilling inside, and Richard's entire understanding of his life began to fracture like ice under pressure. Inside, resting on top of what looked like carefully folded clothing, were dog tags on a beaded chain. Even through the tarnish, Richard could read the stamped letters. Baker, Michael J. The tags his father would have worn every day of his service. The tags that should have been returned with his body, if there'd been a body to return. Beside the dog tags was a photograph in a cracked plastic frame. Richard picked it up with hands that no longer felt like his own. The image was faded, the colors shifted toward yellow, but he could make out every detail. A young man in desert camouflage utilities, maybe 25 years old, grinning at the camera with the kind of joy that looked almost painful. And in his arms, wrapped in a blue blanket, a baby. 6 months old, maybe. Dark hair, wide eyes. Richard knew that baby. He'd seen the same photograph in his mother's house, the only picture of his father she'd kept, and she'd kept it in a drawer, not on display. But there was something different about this copy. On the back, in handwriting Richard didn't recognize, were words written in faded blue ink. Richard, 6 months. Before deployment. I'll be home soon. Promise. Dad. Richard's vision blurred. He blinked hard, set the photograph down carefully, and forced himself to look at what else the trunk held. Letters. Dozens of them, bundled together with rotted rubber bands that disintegrated at his touch. White envelopes, military issue, with APO addresses in the corner and Richard's childhood address written in that same careful hand. Every single one unopened. Every single one addressed to Richard Baker. Beneath the letters, a small wooden box, the kind used for valuables. Richard opened it with fingers that felt disconnected from his body. Inside, A Purple Heart medal in its original presentation case, the ribbons still bright purple and gold. And beneath that, cash. Stacks of $20 bills, old but still good, bound with paper bands that had Richard's college fund written across them in black marker. He didn't count it, but there was thousands of dollars there. Maybe 8,000, maybe more. And at the very bottom of the footlocker, folded with military precision, was a letter on different paper. Heavier stock, personal stationery. Richard unfolded it with hands that shook so badly, he nearly tore the old paper. To whoever finds this, it began. The date at the top read February 20th, 1991. 4 days before his father was declared MIA. For days before Michael Baker disappeared from the world and left behind nothing but questions and a 6-month-old son who would grow up believing his father was a coward. Richard couldn't read past the first line. Not yet. Not standing in this forgotten shed with his dog pressed against his leg and his entire past rearranging itself into a shape he didn't recognize. He sank to the ground, his back against the shed wall, the letter clutched in his hand. Mailo lay down beside him, rested his head on Richard's thigh, and waited. Outside, the November wind picked up, rattling the loose boards, and somewhere in the distance, a crow called out a warning that came 34 years too late. Richard sat there for what might have been 5 minutes or 50. Time had become unreliable, elastic. The cold from the dirt floor seeped through his jeans, and his left leg was going numb where Mailo's head rested against it. But he couldn't bring himself to move. The footlocker gaped open before him like a mouth full of secrets, and he wasn't sure he was ready to swallow what it had to say. He forced himself to look again at what he'd already catalogued. The dog tags caught the weak morning light, spinning slightly on their chain where he draped them over the edge of the trunk. Baker, Michael J. Blood type O positive. No religious preference. The metal was tarnished but intact, the stamped letters still sharp enough to cut if you ran your finger along them wrong. These should have been sent home with notification of death. That's how it worked. Richard knew the protocol. He'd been the one to hand-deliver personal effects to grieving families twice during his own service. Had stood at attention while mothers collapsed and fathers turned to stone. The dog tags always came home, even when the body didn't. So why were his father's tags locked in a trunk in a shed nobody remembered existed? Richard reached for the Purple Heart next, lifting it from its presentation case with a reverence that surprised him. The metal was pristine, the purple and white ribbon still vibrant, the gold-rimmed heart with George Washington's profile catching the light. There was no citation with it, no paperwork explaining what act of valor had earned it. Just the medal itself, never worn, never displayed, never acknowledged. His mother had told him his father died doing something stupid. Probably showing off, she'd said once, her voice flat and cold as February ice. Your father always did care more about looking like a hero than being one. But you didn't get a Purple Heart for showing off. You got it for bleeding, for taking fire meant for someone else, for coming home broken or not coming home at all. Richard set the medal down carefully and turned to the letters. There were so many of them. 30, maybe 40 envelopes bound together with rubber bands that had long since lost their elasticity. When he touched them, the bands crumbled to dust, and the letters spilled across his lap like fallen leaves. Every single envelope bore his name, Richard Baker, written in the same careful hand, the same blue ink. APO addresses in the corners, Army mail postmarks from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq. The dates ran from August 1990 to February 1991. 6 months of correspondence. Half a year of a father writing to his son. None of them had been opened. Richard picked one at random, dated November 15, 1990. His hands trembled as he slid his finger under the seal and tore it open. The envelope was thin, military issue, and the paper inside was the same. Standard Armed Forces stationery. He unfolded it and read. Dear Richard, you're 9 months old today. I wonder if you're crawling yet. Your mom said in her last letter that you were getting close, pulling yourself up on the furniture and scaring her half to death. I wish I could be there to see it. I wish I could be there to catch you when you fall. But I'm here instead, doing what needs to be done so that maybe you'll grow up in a world that's a little bit safer. I know that sounds like a line from a recruitment poster, but it's true. Every day I'm here is one more day you get to be there, safe and warm and loved. I'm counting down, buddy. 87 days until I'm supposed to come home. I've got your picture taped to the inside of my helmet. You're smiling in it, even though your mom said you were crying 5 seconds before she took the shot. That's my boy. Tough when you need to be. I love you more than I know how to say. Dad. Richard's vision blurred. He blinked hard, but the tears came anyway, hot and unexpected, tracking down his cheeks and dripping onto the paper. He wiped at them roughly with his sleeve and grabbed another letter. December 3rd. Then December 20th. January 8th. He read them in random order, devouring them like a man starving, and each one was the same. Love letters from a father to a son. Updates on military life, heavily redacted but full of small details. Complaints about the food, jokes about the heat, stories about the guys in his unit. And always the countdown. 60 days, 45 days, 23 days until he came home. Every letter ended the same way. I love you more than I know how to say. Dad. Richard's chest felt like it was collapsing. He couldn't breathe right. These letters, 30 or 40 declarations of love from a man who supposedly abandoned his family. They didn't make sense. His mother had told him his father left because he was bored with domestic life, because he'd rather chase adrenaline than change diapers, because Richard wasn't enough to make him want to stay. But these letters told a different story. These letters were written by a man who was counting days like a prisoner, desperate to get home to his son. Richard set the letters aside and looked back into the footlocker. Beneath where the letters had been, he found the cash. It was wrapped in a clear plastic bag, the kind you'd use to keep documents dry in hostile conditions. Inside the bag were stacks of $20 bills, neatly bundled and bound with paper bands. On top of the cash was a note, written on the same military stationery as the letters, but this one was dated February 19, 1991. The day before the final letter at the bottom of the trunk. The note was short. For Richard's college. I'm coming home. Dad. Richard pulled out the bundles and counted them with shaking hands. For $100 per stack. 20 stacks total. $8,000. In 1991, that was nearly a year's salary for an enlisted man. His father had saved every penny he could, had denied himself everything, had probably skipped meals and refused leave and worked every extra duty shift available, all to build a college fund for a son he'd barely known. Richard's throat closed up entirely. He couldn't swallow, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what he was seeing. At the very bottom of the footlocker, beneath where the cash had been, was the photograph. He'd seen it briefly when he first opened the trunk, but now he picked it up and really looked at it. His father in desert camouflage, young and grinning, holding an infant wrapped in a blue blanket. The baby's eyes were wide and dark, and even though Richard couldn't remember being that small, couldn't remember that moment, he knew it was real. The joy on his father's face wasn't something you could fake. He turned the photograph over. On the back, in that familiar handwriting, Richard, 6 months. Before deployment. I'll be home soon. Promise. Dad, I'll be home soon. Promise. But he hadn't come home. He'd disappeared in late February 1991, declared MIA, presumed killed in action when his convoy was ambushed somewhere in the Iraqi desert. No body recovered. No closure. Just a telegram and a flag and a family left behind to make sense of the absence. Except now Richard was sitting in a freezing shed with evidence that his father had planned to come home, had saved money for his son's future, had written letters full of love and longing, had earned a Purple Heart doing something brave enough to warrant a medal, even if nobody had bothered to tell Richard what that something was. None of this matched what his mother had told him. None of it aligned with the story Richard had built his entire identity around. He was the son of a man who chose war over family. That's who he was. That's what he told himself every time a relationship fell apart. Every time he pushed someone away before they could leave first. Every time he chose solitude over connection because at least solitude was honest. But what if his mother had lied? What if everything Richard believed about his father, about himself, was built on a foundation that had never existed? The thought was too big to hold. kept slipping away from him, too massive and terrible to grasp. Richard looked at Mailo, who hadn't moved, who was still watching him with those steady dark eyes that had seen him through firefights and panic attacks and nights when the darkness felt like it would never end. "She lied to me," Richard said out loud. His voice sounded strange in the empty shed, rough and broken. "She told me he abandoned us. She told me he didn't care." Mailo's tail thumped once against the dirt floor. "Not agreement exactly, just acknowledgement. I'm here.
I'm listening."
Keep going." Richard picked up the final letter, the one on heavier paper stock, dated February 20th, 1991. His hands were steadier now, though he couldn't have said why. Maybe because the worst of it was already done. Maybe because knowing the truth, even when it shattered everything, was better than living with a lie. He unfolded the letter and began to read. "To whoever finds this," it started. "If you're reading this, something has gone wrong. My name is Sergeant Michael James Baker, and I need someone to know the truth. I need my son to know the truth, if he's old enough to understand. I didn't abandon my family. I didn't choose this war over them. I chose to come home, and if I didn't make it, it wasn't because I didn't try." The letter went on, detailing his father's final mission, the ambush, the choice he'd made to cover his unit's retreat. "I'm writing this the night before we roll out because I have a bad feeling. We all do. Intelligence says the road is clear, but intelligence has been wrong before. If something happens to me, I need Richard to know I loved him. I need him to know I saved every dollar I could for his future. I need him to know I counted down every single day, and all I wanted was to come home and be his father." The letter ended with a request. "Please give these letters to my son. Please tell him I tried. Please tell him he was enough. He was always enough. Michael Baker." Richard folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the footlocker. His entire body felt numb, disconnected, like he was watching himself from a distance. 34 years. He'd spent 34 years hating a man who died trying to come home to him. 34 years building walls against a betrayal that had never happened. And his mother had let him, had encouraged it, had fed him lies like medicine, bitter but necessary, until Richard's anger toward his father became the lens through which he saw every relationship, every disappointment, every failure. Mailo shifted, pressing closer against Richard's leg. The dog's warmth was the only real thing in the world. Richard didn't know how long he sat there, surrounded by evidence of a love he'd never known existed. The morning light shifted as the sun climbed higher, and eventually the cold became unbearable. He stood slowly, his joints stiff, and began carefully placing everything back into the footlocker. The dog tags, the Purple Heart, the letters, all of them, even the ones he hadn't read yet. The cash, the photograph, the final letter explaining everything. He closed the lid gently, as if his father might still be able to feel it, might still be waiting somewhere for news that someone had found his message. Then Richard picked up the footlocker. It was heavier than he expected, weighted with more than just objects, and carried it out of the shed and into the pale November morning. Mailo followed close behind, silent and watchful. Richard didn't know what he was going to do with this truth, didn't know if he could face his mother with it, didn't know if he could forgive her for the years she'd stolen with her silence. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was going to find out what really happened to his father. He was going to learn the truth about Michael Baker's final mission. And he was going to make sure that the man who'd saved every dollar and written all those letters and promised to come home got the recognition he deserved. Even if it was 34 years too late. Richard carried the footlocker into the house and set it on the kitchen table with more care than he'd shown anything in years. Mailo followed him inside, his nails clicking against the hardwood floor, and took up his usual position by the back door. But the dog's eyes never left Richard, tracking every movement with the vigilance of a sentry on watch. The house was cold. Richard had let the fire die hours ago, before their morning patrol, back when the world still made sense. He should rebuild it, should eat something, should do any of the 100 small tasks that structured his days and kept the chaos at bay. Instead, he pulled out a chair, sat down heavily, and opened the footlocker again. The letters seemed to multiply in the better light of the kitchen. So many envelopes, all addressed in his father's careful handwriting, all stamped with dates that spanned 6 months of deployment. August through February, summer through winter, hope through whatever had happened at the end. Richard had read 3 of them in the shed, and they'd nearly destroyed him. Now he had 37 more to get through. 37 more pieces of a father he'd never known, speaking to a son who'd spent his whole life believing he wasn't wanted. He started with the earliest one, dated August 10, 1990, 2 days after his father's unit had deployed. Dear Richard, I've been gone for 48 hours and I already miss you so much it's hard to breathe. Your mom sent me off with a picture of you that I've looked at about 100 times already. The guys in my unit are starting to think I'm obsessed. They're right. You're 6 months old, buddy, and you're already the best thing I've ever done with my life. I know you won't remember this time, won't remember me being gone, but I'm going to write to you anyway. I'm going to tell you about every day so that when I get home, I can tell you the stories and maybe you'll understand why I had to go. Why I had to leave you, even though it's killing me. I'll be home before you know it. Promise. Love, Dad. Richard's hands were steadier now than they'd been in the shed, but the ache in his chest was worse. He moved to the next letter. August 24th, then September 3rd. He read them chronologically, watching his father's handwriting evolve from careful and controlled to rushed and desperate as the months wore on and the mission dragged longer than anyone had expected. September 15th, 1990. Dear Richard, you're 8 months old today. Your mom says you're eating solid food now, making a mess of everything, laughing when she tries to clean you up. I wish I could see it. I wish I could be the one covered in mashed peas, hearing you laugh. We're in the desert now, training for something nobody's telling us about yet, but we all know what's coming. The guys talk about their families at night, show pictures, tell stories. I tell them about you, about how you grabbed my finger the day you were born and held on like you knew I was your dad. Like you knew I'd protect you no matter what. I meant it then and I mean it now. Everything I do here is for you. Love, Dad. October 1st, 1990. Dear Richard, I missed your first Halloween. Your mom sent me a picture of you dressed as a pumpkin, and I've been showing it to anyone who'll look. You're 9 months old and you're the cutest damn pumpkin I've ever seen. I'm sorry I wasn't there to take you trick-or-treating. I'm sorry I'm missing all these firsts, but I keep telling myself it's worth it, that keeping you safe is worth missing a few holidays. I hope someday you'll understand. I hope someday you won't hate me for this. Love, Dad. Richard stopped reading and pressed his palms against his eyes. His father had worried that Richard would hate him, had apologized over and over for missing birthdays and holidays and ordinary Tuesday afternoons, had counted every day away from home like a prison sentence. And Richard had hated him, had grown up hating him, had built an entire identity around being the son of a man who chose war over family, who valued medals over memories, who walked away and never looked back. But that man didn't exist, had never existed. Richard forced himself to keep reading. November 12th, 1990. Dear Richard, you're 10 months old and apparently you're trying to walk now. Your mom says you pull yourself up on the coffee table and take a few wobbly steps before falling on your diaper. She says you cry more from frustration than pain, that you get mad when you can't do something and you keep trying until you get it right. That's my boy. That's the fighter spirit you're going to need in this world. I'm so proud of you, buddy, even though I'm not there to see it. 38 more days until I'm supposed to come home. I've started a countdown calendar. Crossed off every day that passes. The waiting is the hardest part. Love, Dad. December 25th, 1990. Dear Richard, Merry Christmas, buddy. You're 11 months old today, and I'm spending Christmas in a tent in the Saudi desert, eating MREs and trying not to think about what you're doing right now. Are you opening presents? Are you laughing at the wrapping paper? Did your mom get you that stuffed bear I sent home 3 weeks ago? I hope so. I hope she tells you it's from me, that your dad is thinking about you even though he's 8,000 miles away. I've been saving every dollar I can. Every cent that doesn't go to necessities goes into an envelope with your name on it. College fund, I tell the guys, but really it's a future fund. It's for whatever you need, whatever you dream of being. I want you to have choices I never had. I want you to have a life where you don't have to choose between the people you love and the things you believe in. 24 more days. Richard. I'll be home before you know it. Love, Dad. Richard's throat closed up. His father had sent him a teddy bear for Christmas. Richard had never seen it, had never received any gifts from his father, because as far as he'd known, his father hadn't cared enough to send anything. He grabbed another letter, this one dated January 5th, 1991, his birthday. Dear Richard, you're 1 year old today, and I'm not there to celebrate with you. I'm not there to see you blow out your first candle, or make a mess of your first cake, or wear that little birthday hat your mom said she bought. I'm so sorry, buddy. I'm so sorry I'm missing this. I thought we'd be home by now. They told us this would be quick, in and out, but nothing's quick in war. Nothing's simple. We're still waiting for orders, still training, still trying to stay ready for whatever comes next. I sent you a package 2 weeks ago. Some toys, a card, and a letter for your mom explaining how much I miss you both, how much I wish I could be there. 15 more days and my deployment is supposed to end. 15 more days and I'll be on a plane home. I can't wait to hold you again, to hear you say your first words, to watch you walk around the house getting into everything. I can't wait to be your dad in person instead of just on paper. Love, Dad. Richard set the letter down and stood up abruptly. The chair scraped against the floor, and Mailo's ears pricked forward. Alert. Richard paced to the window, stared out at the gray Pennsylvania morning, then paced back. His hands were shaking again, but not with grief, with rage. His mother had hidden these letters, had kept them locked away in a shed and told Richard his father abandoned them, had let him grow up believing he wasn't wanted, wasn't loved, wasn't worth coming home to. She'd had these letters the whole time, evidence of his father's love, his sacrifice, his desperate countdown to homecoming, and she'd buried them like trash. Richard grabbed another letter. January 18th, 1991. Dear Richard, I'm writing this one by flashlight because I can't sleep. We got our orders today. We're moving out in a week, heading into Kuwait to push back the Iraqi forces. The mission is dangerous, everyone knows it, but it's what we've been training for. This is why we're here. I want you to know something, buddy. I want you to know that every choice I've made since the day you were born has been about keeping you safe, about making the world a little bit better for you. Maybe that sounds like propaganda. Maybe it sounds like something they tell us to make us feel better about being away from our families. But it's true. Every morning when I wake up in this desert, I think about you. Every night when I try to fall asleep, I picture your face. You're the reason I'm careful. You're the reason I come back from every patrol. Because I have to get home to you. I have to be your dad. 7 more days and we roll out. 26 more days and I'm supposed to rotate home. I'm counting every single one. Love, Dad. 7 more days. 26 days until he was supposed to come home. Richard's hands trembled as he reached for the next letter. January 28th. Then February 5th. February 12th. The handwriting in these later letters was different. Faster, less controlled, written by a man who was running out of time and knew it. February 14th, 1991. Dear Richard, Happy Valentine's Day, buddy. I know that's weird to say to a 1-year-old, but I'm saying it anyway. We're 3 days into combat operations, and it's bad. Worse than they told us it would be. We're taking fire every day, losing guys I've trained with for months. But we're pushing forward, doing what we came here to do, and I keep telling myself it'll be over soon. 10 more days and my rotation ends. 10 more days and I'm supposed to be on a plane home. I'm holding onto that number like a life raft. 10 days. I can make it 10 more days. I have to, because you're waiting for me, because your mom's waiting for me, because I promised I'd come home, and I don't break my promises. Not to you. Never to you. Love, Dad. 10 days. But Michael Baker had died 6 days later, his convoy ambushed, his body never recovered. 6 days short of making it home. Richard's vision blurred. He blinked hard and reached for the final letter, the one on heavier paper stock, dated February 20th, 1991. 4 days before his father died. 4 days before everything ended. His hands shook as he unfolded it. This one was longer than the others, written in a rush, the handwriting nearly illegible in places. Dear Richard, we're rolling out in 2 hours for a convoy escort mission through hostile territory. Intelligence says the road is compromised, that there are ambush points all along the route, but we don't have a choice. The supply line has to get through or our guys at the front won't have the ammunition and food they need to hold their position. I'm writing this because I have a bad feeling. We all do. The mission commander is nervous, which means the rest of us are terrified, and I need to get this down while I still can. I need you to know the truth in case something happens. In case I don't make it home. Richard, I didn't want to leave you. I didn't choose this war over you. I chose to serve my country because I still believe that keeping you safe meant being willing to fight for you. Not against enemies you can see, but against the chaos that tears the world apart when good people do nothing. Maybe that's naive. Maybe I'm wrong. But it's what I believe, and it's why I'm here. I saved every dollar I could for you. $8,000, all marked for your college fund. It's in the footlocker with this letter, along with everything else I want you to have. My dog tags, the Purple Heart they gave me when I took shrapnel during a rocket attack in January, and all the other letters I wrote to you over the past 6 months. Letters your mom should have been sending to you, but I don't know if she has been. I hope she has. I hope she's reading them to you at night, telling you about me, keeping me alive in your memory even though I'm so far away. But if she hasn't, if something happened and you never got them, then at least you'll have them now. At least you'll know I thought about you every single day. I wanted to be your dad, Richard. I wanted to teach you how to throw a baseball and tie your shoes and drive a car. I wanted to be there for your first day of school, your first broken heart, your graduation. I wanted all of it. But if I don't make it home, I need you to know it wasn't because I didn't try. It wasn't because you weren't enough. You were everything. You were the only reason I wanted to survive this war. I'm finishing this now because the trucks are starting up and it's time to move out. If you're reading this, it means something went wrong. It means I didn't make it back.
I'm sorry, Bobby.
I'm so sorry I couldn't keep my promise. But please, please don't think I abandoned you. Don't think I chose this over you. I fought every single day to get home. I loved you more than I knew how to say. I still do. Love, Dad. Richard's chest heaved. He couldn't breathe, couldn't see, couldn't do anything but sit there and let the grief roll over him in waves. 34 years. 34 years of hating a man who'd written this letter hours before dying in an ambush, who'd spent his final moments trying to get home to his son, who'd fought and bled and saved every penny because he wanted to be a father. And Richard's mother had hidden it all, had taken these letters, this evidence of love so fierce it survived death, and locked them away in a shed where no one would ever find them. She'd looked Richard in the eye and told him his father abandoned them, told him Michael Baker chose war over family, told him he wasn't wanted. She'd lied. About everything. Richard stood up so fast his chair toppled backward. Mailo was on his feet instantly, body tense, ready for whatever threat had triggered his partner's reaction. But the threat wasn't outside. The threat was memory, was 34 years of lies, was the woman who'd chosen bitterness over truth. He needed proof, needed more than just letters and gut instinct. His mother would deny everything if he confronted her with only these. She'd say she never received them, that the army must have made a mistake, that she'd told him what she'd been told. She'd been lying to him for over 3 decades. She wouldn't suddenly start telling the truth just because Richard had found evidence of her deception. He needed documentation, needed military records, needed someone who'd been there, who'd seen what happened, who could confirm that Michael Baker died trying to get home, not running away from it. Richard pulled out his phone and stared at it for a long moment. Then he opened the browser and started searching. Department of Defense.
National Archives.
Freedom of Information Act requests. There had to be records of his father's service, of his final mission, of what really happened on February 24, 1991. There had to be someone out there who knew the truth. Richard glanced at the letters spread across his kitchen table, at the footlocker still open like a wound, at Mailo watching him with those steady, patient eyes. His father had spent his last days writing love letters to a son he'd never see again. The least Richard could do was make sure the truth didn't die with him. He picked up his phone and started making calls. The search for the truth about Michael Baker had begun, and Richard wasn't going to stop until he had every answer. Until he knew exactly what happened to his father. Until he could look his mother in the eye and force her to confront what she'd done. Until he could finally let his father come home. The Department of Defense phone tree was designed to break a person's spirit. Richard had been transferred 7 times in the first hour, passed from automated system to automated system, each one promising that a representative would be with him shortly. He'd heard the same hold music so many times he could hum it in his sleep. Mailo had given up watching him pace and was now sprawled on the kitchen floor, head on his paws, eyes half closed. Richard stayed on the line. He'd survived 2 combat deployments and a decade in the K-9 unit. He could survive government bureaucracy. On the 8th transfer, a human voice finally answered. Female, tired, professional in that way that suggested she'd answered 10,000 calls exactly like this one and expected 10,000 more. National Personnel Records Center, this is Angela speaking. How can I help you? Richard forced himself to speak slowly, clearly. My name is Richard Baker. I'm requesting service records for my father, Sergeant Michael James Baker. He was declared MIA during Operation Desert Storm in February 1991. There was a pause, the sound of typing. Service number? Richard rattled it off from memory. He'd found it on the dog tags, had stared at those numbers until they'd burned themselves into his brain. More typing. A longer pause. Mr. Baker, I'm showing that your father's records are archived. I can submit a request through the Freedom of Information Act, but the turnaround time is typically 6 to 8 months. 6 to 8 months? Richard's voice came out harder than he'd intended. I just need confirmation of his service dates, his final mission, and the circumstances of his death. I understand, Mr. Baker, but archived records from that era require physical retrieval and review. The process takes time. Richard closed his eyes and counted to 5. Losing his temper wouldn't help. Is there anyone who can expedite this? Anyone I can speak to directly? Another pause. You could try contacting the Army Casualty and Mortuary Affairs Operations Center. They handle MIA cases and might have more immediate access to mission records. Let me transfer you. The hold music started again before Richard could respond. He looked at Mailo, who looked back with an expression that might have been sympathy or might have been boredom. Hard to tell with dogs. This transfer took longer. Richard made coffee while he waited, one-handed, the phone pressed to his ear. The coffee was terrible. He'd made it too strong and forgotten sugar, but it was hot and gave him something to do with his hands. Casualty Affairs? Lieutenant Morrison speaking. Richard went through the whole thing again. Name, service number, date of disappearance. Lieutenant Morrison was younger than Angela, his voice crisp and military efficient. Richard recognized the tone. He'd sounded like that once, before the world wore the edges off him. Sergeant Michael Baker, Morrison repeated, and Richard could hear typing in the background. February 24, 1991. Declared MIA following a convoy ambush on Route 8, approximately 40 kilometers southwest of Basra. Presumed killed in action when his position was overrun by Iraqi forces. Body never recovered. Richard's hand tightened on the phone. What can you tell me about the mission? I'm sorry, Mr. Baker, but mission details are classified. What I can tell you is that your father was part of a supply convoy escort when the unit came under heavy fire. Multiple casualties. 3 confirmed Kia. 5 wounded. 2 MIA including your father. The surviving members of his unit provided statements indicating that Sergeant Baker provided covering fire to allow the rest of the convoy to reach safety. He was posthumously recommended for a Bronze Star for valor. Recommended. Richard's voice was sharp. Was he awarded it? A pause. The paperwork shows the recommendation was submitted but never processed. It appears to have been lost in the transition when units were rotating home after the ceasefire. Lost. His father's final act of heroism. Officially lost in paperwork. Richard's jaw clenched so hard his teeth hurt. What about his personal effects? Were they sent home? More typing. Records show that a footlocker containing personal effects was shipped to the next of kin in March 1991. Your mother, Mrs. Catherine Baker, signed for receipt on March 18th. So she'd received it, had opened it, had seen the letters and the money and the photograph, and had chosen to hide it all away, had chosen to lie. I need the names of the surviving unit members, Richard said. Anyone who was there. Anyone who can tell me what really happened. Mr. Baker, I can't release that information without their consent. Privacy regulations. My father died saving those men, Richard interrupted. He died making sure they got home to their families. I think I've earned the right to ask them what happened. Lieutenant Morrison was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had softened slightly. I understand your frustration. What I can do is provide you with the name of your father's commanding officer at the time, Captain Terry Lawson. He gave the official statement regarding the incident, and he might be willing to speak with you directly. I can't give you his contact information, but he's a matter of public record. You should be able to locate him. It was more than Richard had expected. Thank you, Lieutenant. Mr. Baker? Morrison's voice stopped him before he could hang up. For what it's worth, the statements in your father's file all describe the same thing. He was a good soldier. He saved a lot of lives that day. I'm sorry you had to wait this long to hear it. Richard's throat tightened. He managed a rough thank you and ended the call before his voice could break. Captain Terry Lawson. Richard pulled out his laptop and started searching. It took 45 minutes and 3 different People Finder websites before Richard located him. Terry Lawson, now 72 years old, retired military, living in Richmond, Virginia. The same man who'd commanded his father's unit 34 years ago. The man who'd been there when Michael Baker made his last stand. Richard found a phone number listed. His hand hovered over his phone for a long moment. This was it. This was the connection to the truth, to someone who'd actually been there, who'd seen what happened. Someone who could confirm that the man in those letters was the same man who died a hero. He dialed before he could talk himself out of it. The phone rang 4 times. Richard was about to hang up when someone answered. Lawson residence. The voice was male, older, with a southern accent softened by time. Captain Lawson? Terry Lawson. A pause. Haven't been called captain in a long time. Who's this? Richard took a breath. My name is Richard Baker. I'm the son of Sergeant Michael Baker. He served under you in 1991, during Desert Storm. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long Richard thought the connection had dropped. Then, Michael Baker. Jesus Christ. I haven't heard that name in 30 years. I need to talk to you about what happened. About the ambush on February 24th. Another long pause. Richard could hear the old man breathing, could almost feel him deciding whether to hang up or engage. Finally, you said you're Michael's son? Yes, sir. How old are you? 34. I was 6 months old when he deployed. He talked about you constantly, Lawson said quietly. Showed everyone your picture. Had it taped inside his helmet. Drove us all crazy with it, but nobody minded. We all knew. He stopped, cleared his throat. We all knew how much he missed you. Richard's eyes burned. He blinked hard. Sir, I need to know what happened that day. The official record says he was MIA, presumed killed. But I need more than that. I need to know the truth. Lawson was quiet for a moment. This isn't the kind of conversation you have over the phone, son. Where are you located? Pennsylvania. Outside Pittsburgh. That's what, 5 hours from Richmond? 6. About that. Come see me, Lawson said. Come see me and I'll tell you everything. Everything I saw, everything I've carried with me for 34 years. You deserve to know. Your father deserves for someone to know. Richard's hand was shaking. When? Soon as you can get here. I'm retired. I've got nothing but time. And son. Lawson's voice softened. Bring your dog. Michael told me all about wanting to get you a dog someday. I'd like to meet him. Richard looked at Mailo, who was watching him with those steady dark eyes. Yes, sir. I'll be there tomorrow. I'll be waiting. Richard ended the call and set the phone down carefully on the kitchen table. Tomorrow he'd drive to Virginia. Tomorrow he'd meet the man who'd commanded his father's final mission. Tomorrow he'd learn the truth about how Michael Baker died. But first he had to pack. Had to make sure Mailo had food for the trip. Had to print out the letters and bring them along. Because Lawson needed to see them. Needed to know that Michael's final messages had finally reached their destination. Richard moved through the house with purpose now, the aimless grief of the morning replaced by focused determination. He packed a duffel bag with clothes for 2 days. Made sure Mailo's travel gear was ready, food, bowls, leash, the worn blanket the dog preferred. Gathered the footlocker and all its contents. Handling each item with a reverence that would have seemed absurd 3 days ago but now felt necessary. Sacred, even. Night had fallen by the time he finished. Richard stood in his kitchen, surrounded by packed bags and the evidence of his father's love, and felt something shift inside him. The anger was still there, at his mother, at the lies, at the 34 years stolen from both of them. But beneath it was something else. Something that felt almost like hope. His father hadn't abandoned him. Had fought to get home. Had saved money and written letters and counted down the days like a prisoner marking time until freedom. Had died a hero, saving his unit, making sure other fathers made it home to their sons even if he couldn't make it home to his own. Richard had spent his entire adult life believing he was the son of a coward. Tomorrow he'd start learning how to be the son of a hero instead. He called Mailo over, and the dog came immediately, pressing his solid warmth against Richard's leg. Richard buried his fingers in the thick fur at Mailo's neck and held on. "We're going to Virginia tomorrow," he said quietly. "We're going to meet the man who knew Dad. We're going to find out what really happened." Mailo's tail thumped twice against the floor. Richard looked down at the dog who'd found the footlocker, who'd refused to leave the shed until Richard investigated, who'd been trained to detect danger, and had recognized that the biggest danger wasn't a bomb or a weapon, but a lie that had poisoned everything it touched. "Thank you," Richard whispered. "Thank you for finding him." Mailo just leaned harder against his leg, steady and warm and loyal in a way that reminded Richard of everything his father had been and everything Richard had spent 34 years refusing to see. Tomorrow, the truth would finally come home. Tonight, Richard sat at the kitchen table and read his father's letters one more time, memorizing the words, learning the man who'd written them, learning who he'd been before lies had tried to erase him, learning who he could have been if only the world had been kinder, if only Richard had known the truth. The drive to Richmond took 6 hours. Richard left before dawn, the footlocker secured in the back seat, Mailo riding shotgun with his head out the window for the first hour until the highway wind became too much. They stopped twice for gas and bathroom breaks, and Richard forced himself to eat a sandwich at a rest stop even though food tasted like cardboard. His stomach was twisted too tight with anticipation and dread to process anything properly. Captain Terry Lawson lived in a modest ranch house in a quiet suburb south of Richmond. The lawn was precisely maintained, the hedges trimmed with military precision, and an American flag hung from a pole mounted beside the front door. Richard pulled into the driveway at 11:30 in the morning, exactly on time, because habits from the service died hard. He sat in the truck for a moment, engine off, hands on the steering wheel. This was it. The man inside this house had been there when Richard's father died, had seen it happen, had lived with it for 34 years while Richard had lived with lies. Mailo whined softly and nudged Richard's arm with his nose. "I know," Richard said. "I know." He got out of the truck, let Mailo out, and grabbed the footlocker from the back seat. It felt heavier than it had yesterday, weighted with everything he was about to learn, everything he was about to have confirmed. The front door opened before Richard reached it. The man standing in the doorway was tall but stooped, his shoulders rounded by age and gravity. He had white hair cut military short, deep lines around his eyes and mouth, and hands that trembled slightly as he gripped the doorframe. He was wearing jeans and a faded Marine Corps t-shirt, and when his eyes landed on Richard, something in his face crumpled.
Jesus, Lawson whispered.
"You look just like him." Richard's throat closed. He managed a nod, couldn't manage words. Lawson's gaze dropped to Mailo, and some of the tension in his face eased. That's a good-looking dog. German Shepherd. Yes, sir. His name is Mailo. We worked together in the K-9 unit for 10 years. Your father would have loved that. Lawson stepped back from the door. Come on in. Both of you. The house was clean and sparse, decorated with the kind of functional minimalism that spoke of a man who'd spent his life in military housing and never quite adjusted to civilian excess. The walls were covered with photographs, military units, ceremonies, what looked like grandchildren in various stages of growing up. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a row of medals in display cases and a folded flag in a triangle frame. Lawson led them to the living room and gestured to the couch. Richard set the footlocker on the coffee table and sat down. Mailo took up position beside him, close enough that Richard could feel the dog's warmth against his leg. Can I get you something to drink? Coffee? Water? Water would be good. Thank you. Lawson disappeared into the kitchen and returned with 2 glasses of water and a bowl that he set on the floor for Mailo. The dog looked at Richard for permission, got a nod, and drank gratefully. The small kindness made Richard's chest tight. Lawson sat in the armchair across from the couch and studied Richard with the intensity of a man trying to reconcile memory with reality. You said on the phone you were 6 months old when Michael deployed. Yes, sir. He carried your picture everywhere, taped inside his helmet, tucked in his flak vest, folded in his wallet. He'd take it out during downtime and just stare at it. We used to give him shit about it. Told him he was going soft, told him he was going to wear the picture out from looking at it so much. Lawson's voice cracked slightly. He didn't care. He said he needed to remember why he was there, why he was doing what he was doing. Richard couldn't speak, could barely breathe. What did your mother tell you about him? Lawson asked quietly. The question hung in the air between them. Richard took a drink of water to buy time, to give himself a moment to decide how honest to be. Then he decided that if he was here for the truth, he might as well start with it. She told me he abandoned us, that he chose war over family and never came home because he didn't want to. Lawson's face went very still. She told you what? That's what I grew up believing. That my father was a coward who walked away from his responsibilities. Richard's voice was rough, barely controlled. I only found out differently 2 days ago. He reached for the footlocker and opened it. The dog tags were on top, resting on the stack of letters. He picked them up and held them out to Lawson. The old man stared at the tags for a long moment before reaching out with shaking hands. When his fingers closed around the metal chain, his whole body seemed to fold inward. He brought the tags closer, read the stamped letters, and a sound came out of him that was half sob, half gasp. Where did you find these? His voice was barely a whisper. In a footlocker in a shed on my property. My mother received his personal effects in March 1991 and hid them. Hid everything. The letters, the money he saved for my college, his medals. All of it. Richard's hands clenched into fists. She let me believe he abandoned us for 34 years. Lawson closed his eyes, the dog tags pressed against his chest. Tears tracked down his weathered face, and he didn't bother wiping them away. That boy loved you more than anything in this world. More than his own life, as it turned out. Tell me what happened, Richard said. Please, I need to know. Lawson nodded slowly, opened his eyes, and carefully set the dog tags on the coffee table. He took a shaky breath and began. February 24th, 1991. We were 3 weeks into ground operations, pushing Iraqi forces back toward Basra. Your father's unit was assigned to escort a supply convoy, ammunition, food, medical supplies. Route 8 was supposed to be secure, but intelligence was shit back then. Still is, probably. He paused, collecting himself. We were 40 kilometers southwest of Basra when they hit us. RPGs, small arms fire, heavy machine guns. They'd been waiting, dug into positions on both sides of the road. Textbook ambush. Richard's hands were clenched so tight his knuckles had gone white. Mailo pressed closer against his leg. The convoy scattered, Lawson continued. Some trucks made it through, some didn't. Your father was in the rear guard, providing cover for the vehicles trying to push forward. He took up position behind a disabled supply truck and started laying down fire. Saved at least a dozen men with that move, gave them time to get clear, time to find cover, time to call for air support. Lawson's voice broke. He stopped, took another breath. He was hit 3 times. Once in the leg, once in the shoulder, once in the chest. The chest wound was bad. We could see him going down, could see him trying to keep fighting even after he went down. But the Iraqi forces were closing in and we had to make a choice. Pull back with the wounded we could carry, or lose everyone trying to recover a man who was already. He couldn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. We fell back, Lawson said, his voice hollow. We left him there. Left Michael Baker bleeding out behind that truck because if we'd stayed, we all would have died. The position was overrun within minutes. By the time we got air support and pushed back to the site 3 hours later, there was nothing. No bodies, no wounded, nothing. The Iraqis had cleared everything out. Richard felt like something was breaking inside his chest. He was alive when you left him. Yes. Lawson's voice was barely audible. He was alive. And I left him anyway. You made the right call. Did I? Lawson looked up, and his eyes were devastated. I've been asking myself that question for 34 years. Did I make the right call? Should I have stayed? Should I have tried harder to get to him? I was his commanding officer. I was responsible for him, and I left him to die alone in the desert. You saved the rest of your unit, Richard said, forcing the words past the grief in his throat. That's what he was trying to do. That's why he stayed behind. He was buying time for everyone else to live. He was counting down days, Lawson said suddenly. Did you know that? He had a calendar in his gear, and every morning he'd cross off another day. For more days and his deployment was supposed to end. For more days and he was supposed to be on a plane home to you. He talked about it constantly. What he was going to do when he got back. How he was going to teach you to walk, to talk, to throw a ball. How he'd saved enough money to make sure you could go to college someday. Lawson's voice cracked again. He said he'd never miss another birthday. Never miss another Christmas. He was going to make up for lost time. Richard couldn't hold it together anymore. The grief came up like a wave, drowning him, and he bent forward with his face in his hands and let himself break. Mailo pressed his entire body against Richard's legs, a solid anchor in the storm. He cried for the father he'd never known, for the man who'd counted down days and saved money and written letters full of love, for the hero who'd died providing cover so other men could live, for 34 years of believing a lie, for everything he'd lost and everything he'd never had. Lawson didn't say anything, just sat there and witnessed it, the way a commanding officer witnesses the aftermath of battle, with respect and sorrow and the understanding that some wounds never fully heal. When Richard could finally breathe again, when the tears slowed and he could lift his head, Lawson was holding one of the letters from the footlocker, reading it with trembling hands. You kept them, Lawson said softly. The letters he wrote. My mother kept them, hid them. Richard's voice was raw. I only found them 2 days ago. Lawson set the letter down carefully, as if it might shatter. He wrote them every chance he got, sometimes by flashlight in his tent, sometimes sitting on the hood of a truck during breaks. The guys used to tease him about it, but he didn't care. He said you deserved to know him, even if it was just through words on paper. He paused. He never knew she wasn't sending them to you? I don't think so.
Jesus.
Lawson rubbed his hands over his face. That woman stole 34 years from both of you. I know. Richard's voice was hard now, the grief crystallizing into something sharper. And I need to know everything. I need documentation. I need witness statements. I need proof of what really happened so that when I confront her, she can't lie her way out of it. Lawson nodded slowly. I kept copies of everything. The mission reports, the witness statements, the casualty reports. I kept them because... He stopped, his voice thick. I kept them because I needed to remember. Needed to make sure that what happened to Michael Baker didn't disappear into some file cabinet and get forgotten. I owed him that much. Can I see them? I'll make you copies of everything. Lawson stood up, steady now with purpose. And I'll write a statement myself. Everything I remember, everything I saw. Your father died a hero, Richard. He died saving lives. He deserves for people to know that. You deserve to know that. Richard stood as well, Mailo rising with him. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me. Lawson's voice was rough. If I'd done my job right 34 years ago, if I'd fought harder to get his body back, maybe you would have known the truth sooner. Maybe your mother wouldn't have been able to lie to you all these years. You did what you could, Richard said. In an impossible situation, you made the call that saved lives. That's what my father wanted. That's what he died for. Lawson's eyes were wet again. He reached out and gripped Richard's shoulder with a hand that was steadier than it had been when they'd started. He would be proud of you, the man you became, the fact that you're here, that you're fighting for the truth. He would be so damn proud. Richard couldn't speak, could only nod. Lawson looked down at Mailo, who was watching both men with calm, attentive eyes. And he'd be proud that you've got a good dog. He always said that was the mark of a good man, whether a dog trusted him. Richard's hand dropped to Mailo's head, fingers tangling in the thick fur. He found the footlocker, led me right to it. I don't think I would have found it otherwise. Then that dog is a hero too, Lawson said quietly. Just like his handler. Just like Michael. They stood there for a moment in Lawson's living room. Two veterans separated by 40 years and united by the memory of a man who died too young, trying to get home to the son he'd loved more than his own life. Stay for lunch, Lawson said finally. Let me make those copies. Let me write that statement. And let me tell you more about your father. About the man he was, the soldier he was. You deserve to know all of it. Richard nodded. I'd like that. They spent the next 4 hours in that house. Lawson made sandwiches and coffee, pulled out old photographs and mission logs, and told Richard stories about Michael Baker that made him laugh and cry in equal measure. About his terrible jokes and his skill with a rifle and the way he'd volunteered for every dangerous assignment because he said if anyone was going to take the risk, it should be someone who had something worth coming home to. By the time Richard left, he had a folder full of documents, a USB drive with scanned copies of everything, and a handwritten statement from Terry Lawson describing in detail the ambush on February 24, 1991, and the extraordinary courage of Sergeant Michael James Baker. He also had something else, something harder to define but no less real. He had the truth, the whole truth, witnessed and documented and confirmed by a man who'd been there, who'd seen it, who'd carried the weight of it for 34 years. Richard loaded Mailo into the truck, secured the footlocker and the folder in the back seat, and turned to shake Lawson's hand one more time. The old man held on longer than necessary. You bring that woman hell, he said quietly. You make her face what she did. Michael deserves that. You deserve that. I will, Richard promised. He drove out of Richmond as the sun was setting, heading north toward Pennsylvania and the confrontation he'd been building toward since the moment he'd opened that footlocker. Mailo slept in the passenger seat, and Richard drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting on the folder that contained proof of his father's heroism. The truth was finally coming home, and Richard was going to make sure everyone knew it. Richard didn't go home first. He drove straight from Richmond to the Maple Grove Care Facility outside Pittsburgh, arriving just after 8 in the evening. Visiting hours ended at 9, which gave him exactly enough time. He'd called ahead, told them he was coming, ignored the receptionist's suggestion that he wait until morning when his mother would be more alert, more herself. He didn't want her alert, didn't want her prepared, didn't want to give her time to construct whatever lies she'd used to defend herself. Mailo stayed in the truck with the windows cracked and a bowl of water. Richard took only the folder Lawson had given him and the footlocker, one in each hand, weighted with evidence and 34 years of rage. The nursing home smelled like industrial cleaner and boiled vegetables. The fluorescent lights were too bright, casting everything in a harsh, unforgiving glare. A nurse at the front desk looked up as Richard approached, took in his expression, and decided not to ask questions. Catherine Baker, room 147. Down the hall, second door on the right. Richard walked past wheelchairs and walkers, past rooms where televisions played too loud for ears that no longer worked properly, past the defeated architecture of people waiting to die. His mother had been here for 3 years, ever since the stroke that left her right side weak and her memory unreliable. Richard visited once a month, out of obligation more than affection. They never talked about anything that mattered. Tonight, they would talk about everything. Room 147 was small and institutional, decorated with a few personal items that failed to make it feel like home. A quilt on the bed, a lamp on the nightstand, photographs on the dresser. His mother sat in a recliner by the window, staring at a television with the sound muted. She looked smaller than she had a month ago, more fragile, her white hair thin against her scalp and her hands spotted with age. She looked up when Richard entered, and something in her face shifted when she saw what he was carrying. "Richard, I wasn't expecting you tonight." "I know." He set the footlocker on the bed with more force than necessary. The metal clanged against the frame. "We need to talk." Catherine's eyes went to the footlocker, then back to Richard's face. "What is that?" "You know what it is." Richard's voice was cold, controlled, every word precise as a blade. "You signed for it on March 18th, 1991. Had it delivered to the house. Opened it. Read everything inside. And then hid it in Grandpa's shed where nobody would ever find it." The color drained from her face. How did you? "Mailo found it 2 days ago. Led me right to it." Richard opened the footlocker, pulled out the stack of letters, and dropped them on her lap. 38 letters. 38 times my father wrote to me, telling me he loved me, that he was counting down days until he could come home. You never gave them to me, never told me they existed. Catherine stared at the letters like they were something dangerous. Her hands trembled. "Richard, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly." He pulled out the folder next, opened it to Lawson's statement, and held it in front of her face. "I drove to Virginia yesterday. Met Captain Terry Lawson. He was there when Dad died. He told me everything." Her mouth opened, closed. No words came out. "Dad didn't abandon us," Richard continued, his voice getting harder, sharper. "He was 4 days from coming home. 4 days from the end of his deployment. He died in an ambush providing cover fire so his unit could escape. He died a hero, saving lives, trying to get home to me. And you told me he was a coward who chose war over family. Richard, please. I spent 34 years hating him." Richard's voice cracked, but he forced himself to keep going. 34 years believing I wasn't good enough to make him want to stay. That he looked at me and decided glory and medals were worth more than being my father. Do you have any idea what that does to a person? Do you have any idea what that did to me? Catherine's face crumpled. Tears tracked down her weathered cheeks.
"I'm sorry."
"You're sorry." Richard's laugh was bitter, hollow. "You stole my father from me. Twice. Once when he died, and again when you buried the truth about who he was." "I was angry," Catherine whispered. "I was so angry, Richard. He left us. He chose to go to that war, and he died, and I was left alone with a baby and no money and everyone in town looking at me with pity. I couldn't stand it. I couldn't stand being the widow everyone felt sorry for. So you made him the villain instead." "Yes." Her voice broke. "Yes, I made him the villain. I told myself he'd abandoned us, that he'd cared more about being a soldier than being a husband and father. It was easier than admitting he was gone forever. Easier than facing the truth." Richard pulled out the bundle of cash, still wrapped in its note. "For Richard's college. I'm coming home. Dad." He read it aloud, watching her flinch with every word. $8,000. He saved every penny he could. Denied himself everything so I could have a future. And you hid it. You let me take out loans, let me struggle, let me work 3 jobs to pay for school, when all along there was money he'd saved specifically for that. "I didn't know what to do with it," Catherine said, her voice small. "I didn't know how to explain where it came from without explaining everything else. So I left it. Left all of it." "You left it," Richard repeated, like it was trash, like he was trash.
No.
No, Richard. I never thought. What did you think? He was shouting now. Couldn't help it. 34 years of pain pouring out all at once. What did you think was going to happen when you told your son his father didn't want him? When you poisoned every memory, every possibility of knowing who he really was? Catherine was sobbing openly now, her frail body shaking. I thought I was protecting you. I thought if you believed he'd abandoned us, you wouldn't grieve for him, wouldn't miss him, wouldn't spend your whole life mourning someone you couldn't remember. You thought you were protecting me? Richard's voice dropped to something quiet and dangerous. You destroyed me. You made me believe I was the son of a coward. Do you know how many relationships I've ruined because I couldn't trust anyone to stay? How many times I've pushed people away before they could leave first? I've spent my entire adult life terrified of abandonment because you convinced me my own father thought I wasn't worth coming home to. I'm sorry, Catherine whispered again. Richard, I'm so sorry. I was wrong. I was bitter and angry and wrong, and I've regretted it every day since. But I didn't know how to undo it. Didn't know how to tell you the truth without destroying everything. You should have told me anyway. Richard's hands were shaking. He looked down at them, at the folder full of documentation, at the proof of his father's heroism and his mother's betrayal. You should have told me the day I was old enough to understand. You should have given me his letters and his medals and let me decide for myself who he was. I know. Catherine reached toward him with trembling hands. I know, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please, Richard. Please forgive me. Richard stared at her. This woman who'd given birth to him, raised him, fed him and clothed him and taught him how to tie his shoes. This woman who'd also lied to him every single day of his life. Who'd looked him in the eye and told him his father was a coward. Who'd hidden love letters and medals and money because her own pain was more important than the truth. I can't, he said finally. I can't forgive you. Not now. Maybe not ever. Richard. He wrote to me every chance he got. Richard's voice was shaking. Every single letter ended the same way. I love you more than I know how to say. Over and over. 38 times. And I never got to read a single one until 2 days ago. He picked up the letters from her lap, held them against his chest like something precious. These were mine. This was my father trying to reach me. And you kept him away. Catherine was crying so hard she could barely breathe, gasping and choking on her sobs. A nurse appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of distress. But Richard shook his head and she retreated. When the army contacted you, Richard said, forcing himself to stay focused, to get all of it out. When they told you Dad was MIA, what did they say? Catherine wiped at her face with shaking hands. They said his convoy was ambushed, that he was missing in action, presumed killed, that his body couldn't be recovered. They said he died bravely, that he'd saved lives. And you didn't tell me. You were a baby. What was I supposed to say? You could have told me later, when I was 5 or 10 or 15. You could have told me before I joined the army myself. Before I went to war thinking I was following in the footsteps of a man who didn't care about anything but himself. Richard's voice cracked. I became a soldier because I wanted to be different from him. I wanted to be the kind of man who stayed, who honored his commitments. And the whole time I was becoming exactly like him. A man who served with honor, who put others first, who would have died for his unit. Oh, Richard. Catherine's voice was barely audible. I met his commanding officer, Richard continued, Captain Lawson. He's 72 now, and he's carried guilt for 34 years because he had to leave Dad behind to save the rest of the unit. He cried when I showed him Dad's dog tags, told me Dad was a hero, told me he talked about me constantly, that he had my picture everywhere, that all he wanted was to come home. Richard's eyes burned, but he refused to cry in front of her. That man honored my father's memory for 34 years while his own son was taught to hate him. Catherine covered her face with her hands and sobbed. Richard carefully placed the letters back in the footlocker, added the cash, the photograph, the dog tags, the Purple Heart, closed the lid gently and picked it up. I'm going to clear his name, he said. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what really happened. That Sergeant Michael James Baker was a hero who died trying to get home to his son. And you're going to have to live with the fact that you tried to bury that truth. Richard, please don't leave like this. But he was already walking toward the door, the footlocker under one arm, the folder under the other. Richard. Catherine's voice was desperate now, panicked. Please, please don't hate me. I'm your mother. I made mistakes, terrible mistakes. But I love you. I've always loved you. Richard stopped in the doorway but didn't turn around. You loved me, he said quietly. But you loved your own pain more. You loved your bitterness and your anger more than you loved the truth. And I'm the one who paid the price for 34 years. I can't undo it, Catherine whispered. I can't change what I did. But please, please give me a chance to. I need time, Richard interrupted. I need time to process this, to figure out how to live with knowing that my entire life was built on a lie. And I need to do that without you telling me how hard it was for you, how much you were suffering. Because right now, I don't care. The words hung in the air, brutal and honest. Catherine made a sound like something breaking. Richard walked out. He made it all the way to the parking lot before the shaking started. Made it to his truck, got the door open, saw Mailo's concerned face, and collapsed against the driver's seat. The footlocker and folder fell from his hands, and he gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles went white. He'd done it. He'd confronted her. He'd made her admit what she'd done, made her face the consequences of 34 years of lies. And it had broken something inside him that he wasn't sure could be fixed. Mailo climbed over the center console and pressed his body against Richard's side, solid and warm and real. Richard buried his face in the dog's fur and let himself feel everything he'd been holding back in that room. The rage, the grief, the devastating sense of betrayal. All of it poured out in harsh, gasping sobs that tore at his throat. His mother had loved him in her way, but she'd loved her own narrative more, had loved the story of abandonment more than the truth of heroism. And in doing so, she'd stolen his father from him twice, once through death and once through lies. Richard didn't know if he'd ever be able to forgive her, didn't know if he wanted to. Right now, all he knew was that he had his father's letters, had proof of Michael Baker's courage and love, had documentation from the man who'd watched him die bravely, saving lives, counting down the last 4 days until he could come home. It wasn't enough, would never be enough to replace 34 years of knowing his father. But it was more than Richard had yesterday. And tomorrow, he would start the work of making sure his father's sacrifice was recognized, of clearing his name, of telling the world who Michael James Baker really was. Tonight, he sat in a parking lot with his dog and cried for everything he'd lost, everything he'd never had, and everything his mother had stolen when she chose bitterness over truth. Tomorrow, he would honor his father's memory. Tonight, he grieved for both of them. Richard drove home in silence. The confrontation with his mother had drained something essential from him, left him hollow and numb. Mailo sat in the passenger seat, occasionally glancing over with those dark, knowing eyes, but didn't press. The dog understood when silence was necessary. It was past midnight when they pulled into the driveway. The house was dark, cold, unwelcoming. Richard sat in the truck with the engine off, staring at nothing, unable to make himself move. He'd done what he came to do. He'd confronted his mother, made her admit the truth, made her face what she'd done. And it had solved nothing, fixed nothing. The 34 years were still gone. His father was still dead. And Richard was still the son of a hero he'd spent his whole life believing was a coward. Eventually, Mailo whined softly and nudged Richard's arm with his nose. The gentle pressure was enough to break the paralysis. Richard got out of the truck, grabbed the footlocker and folder from the back seat, and headed not toward the house but toward the shed. He didn't know why. The shed was just a structure, weathered wood and rusted hinges, no different from 1,000 other forgotten outbuildings scattered across rural Pennsylvania. But it was where this had started, where Mailo had alerted, where the footlocker had waited for 34 years to be found, where the truth had been buried. The shed door hung open, the way he'd left it 2 days ago. Richard stepped inside, and the cold November air followed him, sharp and biting. He set the footlocker on the dirt floor where he'd first opened it and sank down beside it, his back against the wall. For a long moment he just sat there, breathing, existing, trying to process everything that had happened in the past 48 hours and failing completely. Then something inside him cracked. It started as a tremor in his hands, spreading up his arms and into his chest. His breathing came faster, harder, each breath feeling like it wasn't enough. Like there wasn't enough air in the world to fill the emptiness inside him. The walls of the shed seemed to press closer, and the darkness felt suffocating, and Richard couldn't hold it together anymore. 34 years of grief hit him all at once. He'd never mourned his father. How could he? You couldn't mourn someone you believed had abandoned you. You couldn't grieve for someone you'd been taught to hate. So Richard had buried it all. The questions, the longing, the desperate wish for a father who'd cared, and told himself it didn't matter, that he was fine, that he didn't need anyone. But it had mattered. God, it had mattered so much. The sobs came up from somewhere deep inside him, raw and violent, tearing at his throat. He doubled over, arms wrapped around his middle like he could hold himself together through sheer force of will. But he couldn't. The dam had broken, and everything came flooding out. Rage at his mother for stealing his father's memory. Rage at the army for losing the recommendation for Michael's Bronze Star. Rage at himself for believing the lies so easily, for never questioning, for spending 34 years hating a man who died trying to get home to him. And beneath the rage was grief so vast it felt like drowning. Grief for the father he'd never known, for the letters he'd never received, for the college fund that sat unused while Richard worked himself to exhaustion. For the man who'd counted down days like a prisoner, who'd saved every dollar, who'd written, "I love you more than I know how to say," 38 times and never got to say it in person. Richard's vision blurred. He couldn't see, couldn't breathe properly, couldn't do anything but let the grief consume him. His hands clenched into fists, nails digging into his palms hard enough to draw blood. The pain was grounding, real, something to hold on to when everything else felt like it was disintegrating. Mailo appeared beside him, moving with that silent, purposeful grace that had made him such an effective K-9 partner. The dog pressed his solid body against Richard's side and rested his head in Richard's lap, the weight of it steady and warm and impossibly comforting. Richard's hand moved automatically to Mailo's head, fingers tangling in the thick fur. He held on like Mailo was the only thing keeping him from falling into a darkness he'd never climb out of. "I hated him," Richard whispered, his voice broken and raw. "I spent my whole life hating him, and he never did anything wrong. He loved me, he wanted to come home, and I hated him." Mailo didn't move, didn't pull away, just stayed there, a living anchor, radiating the kind of unconditional loyalty that Richard had never believed he deserved. "For days," Richard continued, the words pouring out now like a confession. He had 4 days left. For more days and he would have been on a plane home. For more days and maybe I would have grown up knowing him. Maybe I would have had a father who taught me to throw a ball and tie my shoes and... His voice broke completely. Maybe I wouldn't be so fucking broken. The sobs came harder now, shaking his entire body. Richard bent forward until his forehead rested against Mailo's shoulder, and he cried like he hadn't cried since he was a child. Cried for his father and for himself and for the 34 years they'd both lost. Time became meaningless. Richard had no idea if he sat there for 10 minutes or an hour. Eventually, the sobs subsided into shuddering breaths, and the grief receded enough that he could think again, could function. He lifted his head and looked around the shed, trying to ground himself in the present. The weak moonlight filtered through gaps in the walls, creating patterns of shadow and silver across the dirt floor. And suddenly Richard saw it clearly. Mailo had found this place, had led him here with the same intensity the dog showed when he detected explosives, had refused to leave, had sat guard over the footlocker like it was the most important mission of his life. Because it was. Richard stared at his partner, and understanding hit him like a physical blow. "You weren't detecting a bomb," he said quietly. "You were detecting danger, but not the kind we trained for. Mailo's ears pricked forward, listening. The real danger wasn't buried in the ground or hidden in a building. Richard's voice was steady now, clear in a way it hadn't been in days. It was buried in my head. The lie. The belief that I wasn't wanted, that I wasn't worth coming home to. That's what was destroying me. That's what you found. Mailo's tail thumped once against the dirt floor. Richard's hands were shaking as he reached for the footlocker and opened it again. The letters were there, all of them, neatly stacked. He'd read them all, memorized them, could probably recite half of them from memory. But there was one he needed to read again. The last one. The one written hours before his father died. He pulled it out and unfolded it carefully. The paper was fragile, worn from being read and reread, and Richard handled it like something sacred. Dear Richard, it began, and this time, Richard didn't just read the words. He heard them, heard his father's voice, clear and strong and full of love. Not the imagined voice of a stranger, but something real. Something that had been waiting for him all along. We're rolling out in 2 hours for a convoy escort mission through hostile territory. Intelligence says the road is compromised, that there are ambush points all along the route, but we don't have a choice. The supply line has to get through or our guys at the front won't have the ammunition and food they need to hold their position. I'm writing this because I have a bad feeling. We all do. Richard's chest tightened, but he kept reading. Richard, I didn't want to leave you. I didn't choose this war over you. I chose to serve my country because I still believe that keeping you safe meant being willing to fight for you. Not against enemies you can see, but against the chaos that tears the world apart when good people do nothing. The words blurred, but Richard blinked hard and forced himself to keep going. I saved every dollar I could for you. $8,000, all marked for your college fund. It's in the footlocker with this letter, along with everything else I want you to have. My dog tags, the Purple Heart they gave me when I took shrapnel during a rocket attack in January, and all the other letters I wrote to you over the past 6 months. Richard's throat closed up. He could see it so clearly now. His father in a tent somewhere in the Saudi desert, writing by flashlight, trying to put everything important into words before it was too late. I wanted to be your dad, Richard. I wanted to teach you how to throw a baseball and tie your shoes and drive a car. I wanted to be there for your first day of school, your first broken heart, your graduation. I wanted all of it. I wanted it too, Richard whispered to the empty shed. God, Dad. I wanted it too. His eyes dropped to the final paragraph. The words he'd read a dozen times but was finally ready to hear. If you're reading this, it means something went wrong. It means I didn't make it back.
I'm sorry, Bobby.
I'm so sorry I couldn't keep my promise. But please, please don't think I abandoned you. Don't think I chose this over you. I fought every single day to get home. I will always fight to come home to you. I loved you more than I knew how to say. I still do. The last sentence repeated in Richard's mind like an echo. I will always fight to come home to you. Not, I tried. Not, I wanted to. I will always fight. Present tense. Continuous action. As if the fighting never stopped, even after death. As if love was something that persisted beyond graves and lies and 34 years of silence. Richard's hand moved to his chest, pressed against the place where his heart was hammering. For the first time since he'd opened the footlocker, he felt something other than grief and rage. He felt his father's presence. Not as a ghost or a memory, but as something real and enduring. Michael Baker had fought to come home, had died trying, and now, decades later, he'd finally made it. Not in the way he'd planned, not in the way anyone would have chosen, but he was here, in these letters, in the truth that Mailo had uncovered, in the love that had survived everything his mother had tried to bury it under. You made it, Richard said out loud, his voice cracking. You made it home, Dad. I found you. Or maybe you found me. I don't know anymore. Mailo shifted, pressed closer against Richard's side. He found me because of you, Richard said, looking down at the dog. You knew something was wrong. You knew I needed to find this. How did you know? Mailo just looked at him with those steady, intelligent eyes. Richard had spent a decade training with K-9s, had learned to read their body language, to trust their instincts even when human senses couldn't detect anything. He knew that dogs could smell fear, could detect illness, could sense changes in their handlers that even the handlers themselves weren't aware of. Maybe Mailo had smelled the grief Richard had been carrying for 34 years without knowing it. Maybe the dog had detected the poison of the lie, the way it had been slowly destroying Richard from the inside out. Maybe Mailo had understood, in the way animals sometimes do, that his partner needed saving. And maybe Michael Baker had somehow known that his son would need a loyal companion to lead him to the truth. Maybe there was something poetic in the fact that Richard had become a K-9 handler, that he'd chosen to work with dogs, that he'd found in Mailo the kind of unconditional loyalty he'd never believed his father had shown. Maybe it was all connected. Maybe it had always been leading to this moment. Sitting in a cold shed with a dog and a footlocker, finally understanding that he'd been loved all along. Richard carefully refolded the letter and placed it back in the footlocker. His hands were steady now, his breathing even. The grief was still there, would probably always be there, but it had shifted into something he could carry. Something that didn't feel quite so much like drowning. "I will always fight to come home to you," he said quietly, repeating his father's words. Okay, Dad. I hear you." He looked at Mailo, who was watching him with patient attention. "He fought to come home," Richard said, "and now I'm going to fight for him. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what he did, who he was. I'm going to give him the honor he deserved 34 years ago." Mailo's tail thumped twice against the ground. Approval, or maybe just acknowledgement. Either way, it was enough. Richard stood slowly, his joints stiff from sitting on the cold ground. He picked up the footlocker and walked out of the shed, Mailo following close behind. The November night was clear and freezing. Stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. He stood there for a moment, looking up at those stars, and wondered if his father had looked at the same stars from the desert, counting down days, thinking about home. "I'm going to make this right," Richard promised the night, the stars, the memory of a man who died too young. "I'm going to bring you home the way you should have been brought home, with honor, with truth, with the recognition you earned." The wind picked up, cold and sharp, and Richard turned toward the house, toward warmth and light and the work that needed to be done. Behind him, the shed stood empty and quiet, its purpose finally fulfilled. The truth had been found, the lie had been exposed, and Sergeant Michael James Baker was finally coming home. Richard spent 2 weeks making the arrangements. 2 weeks of phone calls and paperwork and navigating military bureaucracy that moved at the speed of continental drift. But he was patient. He'd waited 34 years for this. He could wait 2 more weeks to do it right. The first call was to the Department of Veterans Affairs. He explained the situation. MIA soldier from Desert Storm, body never recovered, family finally seeking to honor his memory with a proper memorial service. The woman on the other end of the line was sympathetic but firm about the requirements. Documentation, proof of service, witness statements. Richard had it all thanks to Captain Lawson. The second call was to the local veterans cemetery, a small, well-maintained plot of land on the outskirts of town where rows of white headstones stood at precise attention. The director, a Vietnam veteran named Frank Morrison, listened to Richard's story without interrupting. When Richard finished, there was a long pause. 34 years, Morrison said finally. "That's a long time for a soldier to wait to come home." "Yes, sir. We'll make room for him. And son, we'll do it right." Richard's third call was to Captain Lawson. The old man answered on the second ring, and when Richard explained what he was planning, Lawson's voice cracked with emotion. "I'll be there," he said, "and I'll bring the others. The ones who are still alive anyway. The ones who owe their lives to your father." "You don't have to." "Yes," Lawson interrupted. "We do. Michael Baker saved us. The least we can do is show up when his son finally gives him the honor he deserved." Richard also called the local newspaper, the VA Public Affairs Office, and the Army's Casualty Affairs Division. He wanted this documented, wanted it recorded, wanted Michael Baker's name in print with the words hero and sacrifice attached to it, not abandoned and missing. He did not call his mother. That wound was still too fresh, too raw. Maybe someday he'd be able to face her again, to find some kind of peace with what she'd done. But not yet. Not today. The funeral was scheduled for November 30th, a cold Saturday morning when the sky was the color of steel and the wind cut through clothes like a knife. Richard arrived at the cemetery an hour early with Mailo, both of them wearing their dress uniforms. Richard in his Army service blues, Mailo in his tactical K-9 vest with the patches marking his years of service. Frank Morrison met them at the entrance, shook Richard's hand, and led them to the plot he'd selected. It was in the newer section, beneath a large oak tree that provided shade in summer and shelter in winter. The ground had been prepared, a small rectangular plot marked off with stakes and string, though there would be no casket to lower. Instead, there would be a memorial marker, already in place, waiting to be unveiled. "We took the liberty of having this made," Morrison said, gesturing to the covered headstone. "Standard military issue like all the others. If you want to change anything—" "I'm sure it's perfect," Richard said, his voice tight. People began arriving at 9:30. Captain Lawson was first, climbing out of a sedan with Virginia plates, moving slowly but with the upright posture of a man who'd never quite left the military behind. He was wearing his dress uniform, chest covered with ribbons and medals that spoke of a long and distinguished career. Behind him came 3 other men, all in their 70s, all wearing uniforms that fit a little tighter than they probably had 30 years ago. They moved like soldiers, with that particular awareness of space and formation that never entirely faded. These were the survivors, the men Michael Baker had saved. Richard met them halfway across the cemetery, and Lawson gripped his hand hard enough to hurt. "Thank you for this," Lawson said. "Thank you for giving him this. Thank you for coming." The other 3 introduced themselves. Staff Sergeant James Chun, now 71, who'd been the convoy's senior NCO. Specialist Thomas Wright, who'd manned one of the machine guns and taken shrapnel to his leg in the ambush. And Corporal David Martinez, who'd been 20 years old on February 24, 1991, and was now 54, still carrying the physical and psychological scars of that day. "Your father saved my life," Martinez said, his voice thick. "I was pinned down, couldn't move, and he laid down cover fire long enough for Chan to pull me to safety. I wouldn't be here without him. My kids wouldn't be here. My grandkids wouldn't be here." Richard couldn't speak, could only nod. More people arrived. Veterans from the local VFW post, having heard about the service through Morrison. A few of Richard's fellow K-9 handlers from the unit he'd served with. A reporter from the newspaper with a photographer. And, to Richard's surprise, Lieutenant Morrison from the Army Casualty Affairs Office, who'd made the 5-hour drive from Washington to attend. By 10 o'clock, there were perhaps 50 people gathered around the memorial plot. Not a huge crowd, but more than Richard had expected. More than Michael Baker had received when he'd first died, when the Army had simply marked him as MIA and moved on. Morrison stepped forward and welcomed everyone, speaking briefly about the importance of honoring those who'd made the ultimate sacrifice. Then he invited Captain Lawson to speak. The old soldier moved to the front slowly, pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket, and cleared his throat. For a moment he just stood there, looking at the covered headstone, and Richard wondered if he was going to be able to get through this. Then Lawson began to speak, and his voice was strong. Sergeant Michael James Baker was 26 years old when he died on February 24, 1991. He'd been deployed to the Middle East for 6 months. He had 4 days left on his rotation. 4 days until he was supposed to come home to his wife and infant son. But on that day, his convoy was ambushed on Route 8, southwest of Basra, and Michael made a choice. He could retreat with the rest of us, seek safety, save himself. Or he could stay behind and buy time for others to escape. He chose to stay. Lawson's voice wavered slightly, but he continued. "I was his commanding officer. I gave the order to fall back, to leave him behind, because if we'd stayed, we all would have died. That order has haunted me for 34 years. But today, standing here with the men whose lives Michael saved, I'm choosing to remember something else. I'm choosing to remember that Michael Baker died doing what he trained to do, protecting his brothers in arms. He died a hero, and today, finally, we're acknowledging that. He paused, looked directly at Richard. Michael talked about you constantly, showed everyone your picture, counted down the days until he could come home to you. You were his reason for fighting, his reason for being careful, his reason for wanting to survive. And even though he didn't make it home, I want you to know that every decision he made, every risk he took, was with you in mind. You were loved, Richard Baker. You were loved more than you'll ever know. Richard's eyes burned, but he held it together. Barely. Lawson stepped back, and Lieutenant Morrison came forward carrying a triangular wooden box. He opened it to reveal a folded American flag, crisp and perfect, the stars aligned precisely. Sergeant Baker's family never received a flag at the time of his death, Morrison said. That was an oversight, an injustice. Today we correct that. He turned to Richard, holding the flag out with both hands. On behalf of the President of the United States Army, and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your father's honorable and faithful service. Richard took the flag, the weight of it familiar and profound. He'd presented flags to grieving families during his own service. Had never imagined he'd be on the receiving end. The fabric was cool and smooth under his fingers, and he held it against his chest like something sacred. Morrison then produced a document from his briefcase, official and embossed with military seals. Additionally, I'm authorized to present this posthumous commendation. After review of the witness statements and mission records, Sergeant Michael James Baker is officially recognized for extraordinary heroism in combat. He is awarded the Bronze Star with Valor Device for his actions on February 24, 1991, and his sacrifice in service to his nation. The Bronze Star, the award that had been recommended and lost in paperwork 34 years ago, finally issued. Richard took the document with shaking hands. Behind him, he heard camera shutters clicking as the newspaper photographer captured the moment. Frank Morrison stepped forward next. If you're ready, Richard, we'll unveil the memorial. Richard nodded. He couldn't trust his voice. Morrison and Lawson moved to the covered headstone and, together, lifted the cloth away. The marble was white and pristine, matching all the others in the cemetery. At the top was the military insignia, crossed rifles with a wreath denoting infantry. Below that, engraved in sharp, clean letters, Sergeant Michael James Baker, United States Army, August 15, 1964 to February 24, 1991, Operation Desert Storm, Bronze Star, Purple Heart. I will always fight to come home to you. Richard had chosen the inscription himself, taken from his father's last letter. And now, seeing it carved in stone, permanent and public, something inside him finally settled. The lie had been erased. The truth was here, solid and enduring, for anyone who passed by to read. His father had fought to come home, and now he had. Would you like to say anything? Morrison asked quietly. Richard stepped forward, still holding the flag. Mailo moved with him, staying close. For a long moment, Richard just looked at the headstone, at his father's name and the words that defined who he'd been. I'm sorry it took so long, he said finally, his voice rough. I'm sorry you had to wait 34 years for someone to tell the truth about you. I'm sorry I believed the lies. I'm sorry I hated you when you deserved to be honored. He paused, swallowed hard. But I know the truth now, and I'm going to make sure everyone else knows it too. You're not missing anymore, Dad. You're not forgotten. You're home. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the dog tags. They caught the weak November sunlight, flashing silver. He'd cleaned them, polished them until the engraved letters were sharp and clear.
Baker, Michael J.
Richard knelt beside the headstone, Mailo settling beside him, and carefully dug a small hole in the earth at the base of the marker. He placed the dog tags inside, along with the Purple Heart from the footlocker. Then he covered them, patting the dirt down gently, burying them not in shame but in honor. Rest easy, he whispered. You're home now. Behind him, someone began to sing. It was one of the old veterans, his voice weathered but strong, and the words of taps carried across the cemetery like a prayer. Others joined in, the melody swelling and fading, the traditional farewell to fallen soldiers. Day is done, gone the sun, from the lakes, from the hills, from the sky. All is well, safely rest, God is nigh. Richard stood, stepped back, and saluted. Sharp, crisp, holding the position until the last note faded into silence. Around him, every veteran present did the same. Even those in civilian clothes raised their hands to their brows, a final gesture of respect for a brother who'd fallen too young. When Richard finally lowered his hand, Captain Lawson was beside him. "He'd be proud of you," the old man said quietly. "The man you've become, the soldier you were, the way you fought for him. He'd be so damn proud." Richard's throat was too tight to respond. He just nodded. The ceremony concluded, and people began to disperse slowly, stopping to shake Richard's hand, to thank him for honoring his father, to share brief stories about their own service and the brothers they'd lost. The 3 survivors from Michael's unit stayed longest, standing before the headstone as if keeping watch one last time. By noon, the cemetery was empty except for Richard, Mailo, and the rows of silent white stones. Richard stood before his father's memorial for a long time, the folded flag in his arms, trying to find words that felt adequate and failing. "I found your letters," he said finally. "All 38 of them. I read every single one. I know about the college fund. I know about the countdown calendar. I know that you loved me more than you knew how to say." He paused. "I love you too, Dad. And I'm sorry I didn't get to tell you while you were alive. But I'm telling you now. And I'm going to keep telling you. Every time I visit. Every time I think about you. For the rest of my life." The wind picked up, rustling the oak leaves overhead, and Richard chose to believe it was his father's way of saying he'd heard. He placed the flag carefully at the base of the headstone, a temporary offering until he could get a proper display case made. Then he and Mailo walked back to the truck through rows of fallen heroes, all of them finally at rest. Behind them, Sergeant Michael James Baker's name stood carved in marble, permanent proof that he'd existed, that he'd served, that he'd sacrificed everything to protect others. The truth had finally caught up with the man who'd died trying to come home. And Richard Baker, the son who'd spent 34 years hating a hero, could finally begin to heal. Spring came slowly to rural Pennsylvania that year, the winter reluctant to release its grip on the land. But by late March, the snow had finally melted, and the first green shoots were pushing through the thawed ground. Richard noticed these things now in a way he hadn't before. The changing seasons, the persistence of life, the way the world kept turning even after everything changed. 3 months had passed since the funeral. 3 months since his father's name had been carved in marble and his sacrifice had been made public. The newspaper had run a full feature, complete with photographs of the ceremony and interviews with the surviving unit members. The story had been picked up by a veterans blog, then a military history website, and eventually made its way to a few national news outlets. Sergeant Michael James Baker's story was no longer buried in a forgotten shed. It was out in the world, a testament to heroism and sacrifice. But the story Richard was still figuring out how to tell was his own. He'd gone back to the nursing home in January, 6 weeks after the confrontation. He'd sat in his truck in the parking lot for 20 minutes, trying to decide if he could do this, if he was ready. Mailo had watched him with patient eyes, waiting for Richard to make the decision. Finally, Richard had gotten out of the truck and walked inside. His mother looked smaller than she had in November, more fragile, as if the weight of her confession had physically diminished her. When she saw him standing in the doorway of her room, her face crumpled with relief and fear in equal measure. "Richard," she whispered, "you came back." "I came back," he confirmed. He didn't sit down, didn't make himself comfortable, just stood there with his hands in his pockets, trying to find the words. "I'm so sorry," Catherine started, but Richard held up a hand. "I know you are, and I know—" He stopped, took a breath. "I know you were in pain. I know losing Dad was hard, and being a young widow with a baby was harder. And I know you were angry and scared and overwhelmed. That doesn't excuse what I did." "No," Richard agreed. "It doesn't. but I'm trying to understand it. I'm trying to see it from your perspective, even though it's—" His voice cracked. "Even though it's hard." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "I don't deserve your understanding. Maybe not, but I'm giving it anyway. Not for you. For me. Because carrying this rage around is exhausting, and I can't live the rest of my life the way I lived the first 34 years. I can't keep letting lies poison everything." They talked for 2 hours that day. Not about forgiveness, Richard wasn't ready for that, might never be ready for that, but about truth. About the woman Catherine had been at 24, widowed and bitter and drowning in grief she didn't know how to process. About the choices she'd made out of pain rather than malice. About the fact that understanding why someone hurt you didn't mean the hurt disappeared. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully forgive you," Richard had said before he left. "But I don't want to hate you anymore. I don't want that taking up space in my life." Catherine had nodded, wiping at her eyes. "That's more than I deserve. Thank you." Richard had started visiting her once a week after that. The conversations were still awkward, still weighted with everything that remained unsaid. But they were talking, and sometimes that was enough. In February, Richard had taken the $8,000 from the footlocker, the college fund his father had saved, and added $20,000 of his own savings. He'd established the Sergeant Michael J. Baker Memorial Scholarship through the local community college, awarded annually to the child of a military service member pursuing higher education. The first recipient would be selected in the fall. The lawyer handling the paperwork had asked Richard if he wanted to be involved in the selection process. "No," Richard had said. "I trust you to pick someone who needs it, someone whose parents served. That's what my father would have wanted." The scholarship had been announced in the newspaper alongside another article about Michael's story. Richard had received letters from veterans' families thanking him, sharing their own stories of loss and sacrifice. Some of them had been dealing with similar situations: missing service members, incomplete records, families left without closure. That's when Richard had started volunteering with the Veterans MIA Recovery Network, a nonprofit that helped families navigate the bureaucracy of finding information about missing service members. He spent 2 evenings a week in their small office, helping people file FOIA requests, connecting them with casualty affairs offices, sharing what he'd learned from his own search for the truth. It was hard work, often heartbreaking, but it felt right. Felt like honoring his father's memory in a tangible way. Every family that found answers, every soldier who was finally accounted for, felt like a small victory against the chaos and confusion that war left behind. "Your father would be proud," one of the other volunteers had told Richard last week. An older woman named Helen, whose brother had been declared MIA in Vietnam in 1968, and whose remains had finally been identified and returned in 2019. "He'd be proud that you turned your pain into purpose." Richard hoped that was true. This morning, like every morning since November, Richard and Mailo walked the perimeter of the property at dawn. But their route had changed. Now, instead of avoiding the shed, they went there first. Richard had spent 2 weeks in January restoring it. He'd replaced the rotted boards, reinforced the foundation, patched the roof, and painted it a dark forest green. The door hung straight on new hinges, and inside, the space had been transformed from a forgotten dumping ground into something that felt almost sacred. He'd cleaned out all the debris and installed simple wooden shelves along one wall. On those shelves sat the footlocker, still containing his father's letters and the photograph and the bundle of cash that had started the scholarship fund. Beside the footlocker was a framed copy of the newspaper article about the funeral, and next to that, a shadow box containing his father's Bronze Star and a copy of the commendation. On the wall opposite the shelves hung a wooden plaque that Richard had commissioned from a local craftsman. The wood was reclaimed oak, sanded smooth and stained dark. The words were carved deep and painted gold. SGT Michael James Baker, United States Army, August 15, 1964 to February 24, 1991. Hero. Father, never forgotten. I will always fight to come home to you. This morning, the April air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of wet earth and new growth. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. Richard opened the shed door, and morning light spilled across the plaque, making the gold letters shine. Mailo entered first, as he always did, moving to his customary spot beside the footlocker. The dog sat at attention, as if standing guard, and waited for Richard to follow. Richard knelt before the plaque, the wooden floor solid beneath his knees. He reached out and traced the carved letters of his father's name with his fingertips, feeling the grooves and ridges, the permanence of it. "Morning, Dad," he said quietly. It had become his ritual, starting each day with this moment of connection. The scholarship fund is officially established. First recipient will be chosen in 6 months. I think you'd like that. Helping some kid go to college the way you wanted to help me. He paused, his hand resting flat against the plaque. "I saw Mom yesterday. We're working on it. I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive her, but I'm trying to understand, trying to see past my anger to the person she was when she made those choices. You loved her once, so there must have been something good there. I'm trying to find it again." Mailo shifted slightly, a quiet reminder that he was there. "I've been helping other families," Richard continued. "People looking for answers about their missing service members. It's hard work, but it feels right. Feels like I'm doing something that matters. Something you'd approve of." The morning light grew stronger, brighter, filling the small shed with warmth. "I'm okay now," Richard said, and realized as he said it that it was true. "I'm not fixed. I don't think you ever really fix something like this. But I'm okay. I know who you were. I know what you did. I know you loved me. And that's enough. It has to be enough." He stood slowly, his knees protesting the movement, and took one last look around the shed. This space that had once held lies and secrets now held truth and memory. This place where Mailo had found the footlocker now served as a memorial to a man who deserved better than to be forgotten. "Thank you for coming home, Dad," Richard whispered. "Thank you for fighting so hard to reach me. I'm sorry it took so long. But you're home now. Finally home." Mailo stood as well, moving to Richard's side, and together they walked out of the shed. Richard closed the door carefully behind them but didn't lock it. There were no more secrets here, no more lies to protect, just memory and love and the truth that had finally been set free. They walked across the property toward the sunrise, following their established route through the awakening landscape. The grass was still wet with dew, and birds were beginning their morning songs, and somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed. Ordinary sounds of an ordinary morning in an ordinary place. But Richard felt different, lighter, as if he'd been carrying a weight for so long he'd forgotten it was there, and only now that it was gone could he feel the difference. He thought about his father often now, but not with the rage and confusion that had defined those first days after finding the footlocker. Now he thought about Michael Baker with a kind of bittersweet fondness. Wondered what his father would think of the man Richard had become. Wondered what advice he might give. Wondered what it would have been like to throw a baseball with him or learn to drive or sit on a porch somewhere and just talk. He'd never know. That door was closed forever. But he had the letters. He had the stories from Lawson and the other survivors. He had the memorial in the shed and the headstone in the cemetery. He had proof, tangible and undeniable, that he'd been loved. And maybe that was enough to build a future on. Maybe knowing the truth, even when it came 34 years late, was enough to heal the wound that lies had left behind. Mailo barked once, sharp and alert, and Richard snapped back to the present. The dog was staring at something in the tree line, body tense but not alarmed. Probably a deer. They saw them often on their morning walks. "Easy," Richard said, and Mailo relaxed immediately, returning to his position at Richard's side. They continued their patrol, circling the property as the sun climbed higher and the day officially began. When they reached the point where they'd normally head back to the house, Richard paused and looked back toward the shed. From this distance, it looked like what it was. A simple outbuilding, weathered but well-maintained, nothing special about it. But Richard knew better. Knew that inside those walls was a testament to loyalty and love. Knew that Mailo had found more than just a footlocker that November morning. He'd found the truth that set Richard free. "Good boy," Richard said, crouching down to scratch behind Mailo's ears. "You're such a good boy. You found him. You brought him home." Mailo's tail wagged slowly, and the dog leaned into Richard's touch, accepting the praise as his due. They stood there for a moment, man and dog, backlit by the rising sun, and Richard felt something he hadn't felt in longer than he could remember. Peace. Not happiness exactly, there was still too much loss for that, but peace. The kind that comes from knowing you've done everything you could. That you've honored the people who deserved honoring. That you've told the truth when it would have been easier to stay silent. "Come on," Richard said finally, straightening up. "Let's go home." They walked back to the house together, Mailo staying close the way he always did, and Richard felt his father walking with them. Not as a ghost or a haunting, but as a presence. A memory that had been loved back to life. Inside, Richard made coffee and fed Mailo and started the simple routines that would carry him through another day. But first, he sat down at the kitchen table and pulled out the folder where he kept his father's letters. He selected one at random, dated December 8, 1990, and read it while his coffee grew cold. "Dear Richard, you're 10 months old today and apparently you're obsessed with anything that makes noise. Your mom says you've discovered that banging pots and pans together is the best thing ever invented. She sounds exhausted in her letters, but I can hear the love in her words. I wish I could be there to experience the chaos with her. I wish I could be the one getting no sleep because you're banging on cookware at 5 in the morning. These are the moments I'm missing, and they're adding up faster than I can count them. But I'm coming home. Promise, buddy. I'm counting down the days, and in 62 more mornings, I'll be there to hear you bang those pots yourself. Can't wait. Love, Dad." Richard smiled through the ache in his chest. 62 days. His father had been counting, had been fighting to get home, had made it to within 4 days before the universe decided otherwise. But he'd made it home eventually. It had taken 34 years and a loyal dog and a son who'd finally learned the truth. But Sergeant Michael James Baker had finally come home. And Richard Baker, the son who'd spent most of his life lost, had finally found his way forward. Outside, the sun continued to rise, and the world continued to turn. And in a small shed on a rural Pennsylvania property, a memorial stood guard over the memory of a hero who'd loved his son more than life itself. Never forgotten, always loved, finally home.